Hey folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. Perhaps it's somewhat late for a Happy New Year greeting, but nonetheless, I'm wishing you all the best for 2020, a most momentous year astrologically, sociologically, spiritually for the planet. So it's the first video podcast up for the year, and some of you may have noticed that I've been gone for a while, since about November or so. So I'd like to thank all of you who sent me emails just to check in. It was so appreciated. So, notwithstanding the less savory aspects of the internet can be used as a way to foster meaningful human connections. It can be a wonderful way of, let's say, extending our humanity, reaching our humanity, our humaneness across borders, across nationalities, and find the things that bind us together as a species. And as we elevate ourselves in consciousness, and as we find that we have some important planetary ingresses into the sign of Aquarius this year, it is imperative for us to start to see ourselves as a species, as Earth humanity, and to let that awareness filter into how we treat each other, and to take greater custodianship of the planet as a whole, and begin to do more of the things that, let's say, help to bring a certain dignity to being human, or help restore a certain dignity to being human. So no matter what we have going on, the human experience is worthwhile, and we are charged with the task of elevating what it means to be a human being on Earth, located right on the fringes of the Milky Way galaxy. So Aquarius takes into account these vast collective systems, and so we can extend our minds to the solar system and the wider cosmos of which we are a part. So we are charged with the task of getting it right on our planet, so that we can demonstrate or broadcast a template of human dignity, elevated consciousness, responsibility, integrity, human creativity, and ingenuity. Yes. So if you're here on Earth, especially at this rather exciting juncture at 2020, your greater personage, your soul, knows why it's here to participate in this collective moment. So of course, we've spoken about this on the channel on many occasions in different ways. As we know, we've entered 2020 with a Saturn Pluto conjunction. You couldn't miss it if you tried. The beginning of a new Saturn Pluto synodic cycle. So this is a boulder-like energy and a sort of psychic slowdown of sorts. So from the time that Saturn and Pluto were within 5 degrees of each other, perhaps you may have been psychically sensing a sort of heavier energy, sensing more being demanded of you. And a few of you have written to me, especially those of you who are being more directly affected by Saturn and Pluto's activity. You've written me to say that you've been feeling psychically just the impact of this energy, a sort of slowdown of your energy, not necessarily being lethargic, but a deepening, contracting, slowing down of your psychic energy, which may have made a lot of your usual activity more challenging to do. So as we get more into a deeper understanding and appreciation of the astrology, we will begin to, in the future, we begin to chart the bioenergetic effects of the planetary alignments, the effect on the collective, let's say, auric field, a contraction of energies and a slowing down. It's almost the idea of kind of grinding to a halt. So a dense sort of energy, very heavy. So many of you have been registering that for the last few months as Saturn and Pluto have been engaging each other. So on my end, personally, it's been a bit challenging to get things done in the same way, but new developments in my family as well, welcoming two newborns born in December, late December 2019, early January. So both children born with Saturn Pluto conjunct. So from a soul perspective, it begs the question, what are they coming in to do in this lifetime? And from a kind of family of consciousness perspective, it begs the question of what imprints they carry and what their duties are in their lifetime. So usually people born with Saturn Pluto conjunct are coming in to deal with some big energies. They're here to do deep psychic work, and they can tend to take on a lot on the soul level. So Saturn on one level in the natal chart speaks to the activities, the duties, and responsibilities of the soul as it comes into embodied life. So on one level, Saturn speaks to what it is the soul wants to accomplish while connected to the body in physical terms. So Saturn is linked to the vocation, which we could reduce to what the soul is here to achieve in its earthly life. So Saturn cues us into the physical life as itself a master work, a sort of magnum opus in its own right. All right, so obviously 2020 is an important year. It's sandwiched between a Saturn-Pluto conjunction and a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. And as we discussed in the Jupiter in Capricorn video podcast, we have Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn in step with each other this year. So Saturn itself is also dancing between the late degrees of Capricorn and the very early degrees of Aquarius. So thematically, in broad terms, we have the interplay between the breakdown and restructuring of systems, a breakdown and restructuring of the institutional systems in place which administrate human life and human society. Of course, that breakdown symbolically represented by Saturn, Pluto in Capricorn. So we have that and the interplay of that with rebuilding new systems, Saturn in Aquarius, based on new thought processes. So Aquarius is an air sign and speaks to the collective thought matrix. So Aquarius represents new ideas. So Saturn in Aquarius has to do with building, concretizing new thought, and building new systems based on new thought. It has to do with the introduction of new energy into the collective mental grid, so to speak. But with Aquarius, there is invariably a value shift, a rebellion against where facets of the Capricorn establishment are no longer suited for the overall direction that the collective is going in or wants to go in. So Saturn in Aquarius, in terms of the energy of it, speaks to the creation of new systems based on a value shift, which involves a rejection of, rebellion against, and moving forward from what has become staid and old. So there is a shift of values. So as Saturn goes into Aquarius ahead of Pluto, entering Aquarius in 2023, let's highlight two major sorts of themes or trends. So one is Saturn in Aquarius sort of portends a facing up to the consequences of our actions in Aquarian domain. So most notably technologies, mass technologies that have to do with the collective mental grid, the internet being a prime example here, and also, our collective relationship to our devices. So we are moving into having to take a hard look at the consequences of all that. So as Saturn goes into Aquarius, we're going to be facing up to some of the more challenging realities of the effects of certain technologies, wireless technologies on the human body, and this will begin to coincide with there being a more concrete understanding of, let's say, the disharmonies that the use of many of these technologies create in the body. So there will be, let's say, for the first time, beginning to take seriously certain illnesses in the body and mind as a result of our relationship to our devices. So certain illnesses that crop up as a result of our relationship to our devices. And as Pluto enters Aquarius in 3 years' time, we're going a bit further here, but Pluto will dig up, or let's say unearth, some of the more nefarious activity going on in terms of technology and humanity, being exposed to more of the darker side of our use of technology, and how certain players in big tech have misused their power in relation to the technology being offered to the species. And in many ways, how certain technologies are essentially, strong word here, but essentially a betrayal of the species. So some of you have begun to question, for example, what Alexa is really doing inside your home. Also, the behind the scenes strangeness of what is taking place in certain laboratories, especially as it relates to AI. So we're going to have to take a look at all that. But secondly, on the other end of the spectrum, the energy of Saturn in Aquarius, beginning to be ushered in, is going to support people being inspired to take on their duty toward the collective. So with Saturn Pluto in Capricorn, there is this understanding of what doesn't work, of what is in decay, what needs to be broken down. And then with Saturn in Aquarius, there is an emerging ingenuity that is born out of a sense of responsibility toward the collective. So the impetus to build new systems, as we have a strong sense of what is no longer working. So ingenuity in terms of the creation of new systems, new ideas, fueled by people of integrity who have a sense of an ethical responsibility toward the planet. So people in their individual lives and through their individual interests, laying the groundwork for new systems based on new consciousness. But we'll speak about Saturn in Aquarius in far more detail. As usual, we will dedicate an entire video to that around March, when Saturn dips into the sign. And of course, as Saturn moves into Aquarius, people with important astrological placements in the early degrees of the fixed signs, well, the spotlight now begins to turn to you. But we're not there yet, so let's reflect some more on Saturn in Capricorn and the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So firstly, with Saturn in Capricorn, people born in the late 1980s, early 90s, have had or are having their first Saturn return. So they are beginning to take their place in the world and are coming into real adulthood in a bio-spiritual way. So the energy field matures. They are now fully adults. But as we think about a Saturn-Pluto toolkit, what we want to think about is what psychological orientations are required to meet this Saturn-Pluto energy. What states of mind and attitudes are required from us. So the psychological orientations required and the spiritual imperatives of a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So just to backtrack, Saturn and Pluto have been working together throughout 2019. In 2019, Saturn and Pluto have had overlapping retrograde periods in Capricorn, and most notably, they've both joined up with or triggered the south node of the moon. And of course, with the south node being in Capricorn as Saturn has been in Capricorn, this has been very, very important. So we have a meeting of the past here, facing the consequences of our misaligned actions, especially in respect of our institutions and how we deal with the question of authority. So with Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn working jointly in the sign and with overlapping retrograde periods, We've been immersed in this sort of deep psychic work, collectively facing up to the karma of misaligned actions, which stem out of a misaligned relationship with the Capricorn sign principle. So, where have we not taken responsibility? Where have we given away authority? And the idea of abuse of authority. So, Pluto in Capricorn as well, the nefarious underbelly of institutions, covert manipulation, the shadow of governmental, political, and institutional structures, the demand for transformation of these structures, lessons around the right use of power, corruption, where we've lost our way in terms of the shadows of the Capricorn archetype. So, lack of care and concern, excessive control, superiority complexes, abdication of responsibility, as we said, covert manipulation by institutions, Pluto in Capricorn, pursuit of corporate bottom lines, big business at the expense of human, plant, and animal life. So Saturn, Pluto, and the South Node in Capricorn, facing the spiritual, evolutionary, and karmic consequences of just, again, our misaligned actions in the domain of our collective administrative systems and structures. So, with this conjunction in 2020, we are in very heightened ways ushering in a period where, on personal and collective levels, we're given the task of first creating reality, Saturn, from a consciousness of greater empowerment, Pluto. So, Saturn Pluto asks us to take a hard look at where we've become disempowered, our personal and collective relationship to power. So perhaps in your own personal life, you think about this question: who or what have I given away my power to? And how am I now being asked to take responsibility for that Saturn, creating my reality against Saturn from a place of more inner power, Pluto? And perhaps those of you who are minded to think this way, the broader question becomes, as a collective, who or what are we giving away our power to? And if we think about it long enough, we see the connection, the relationship between what is happening on the collective level and what is happening on the individual level. In other words, it is our individual relationships with the question of personal power and how we manage that creates in turn a collective relationship to power. So as Saturn Pluto portends the breakdown of certain institutions, along with Uranus in Taurus, which upsets a certain sense of psychological security and constancy and comfort, all Taurian things. When our systems break down and our security is unsettled, how are we going to respond? Do we place all of our faith in these institutions, or does this breakdown of systems, Saturn Pluto in Capricorn, represent an invitation into higher levels of personal and collective power and responsibility? So when government fails you or whatever else, what are you going to do? So as Saturn dances between the late degrees of Capricorn and the early degrees of Aquarius, the push now is sort of toward assuming the responsibility of using our individual ingenuity to reclaim our power. So people beginning to claim their power and solve their problems outside of the structures of broken institutions. So some people will take up the mantle to do just that, and other people will feel very victimized. So there's always that polarity there. So Saturn Pluto conjunct brings our attention to the deepest of spiritual tests and what is demanded from us or of us spiritually and emotionally. So in the astrological natal chart, Pluto is often a highly psychically charged place where there can be a lot to overcome in order to move from states of disempowerment into states of empowerment. So Saturn testing in relation to Pluto the most emotionally charged and often wounded places within us. So as Saturn Pluto interacts with the planets in our natal charts, the various dimensions of our psyche, they demand restructuring and profound transformation. So if it's your sun that is being affected, then it's your self-expression, who you are, your beingness on the most holistic level that's up for restructuring and profound transformation of its expression. If it's your moon, then it's a restructuring and profound transformation of your inner landscape, your inner self-image, your relationship with your past psychic patterns and habitual responses and reactions. You know, what gives you a sense of security, a comfort, and inner equilibrium. Uh, if it's your Mercury, then what is demanded is a restructuring and deep transformation of your perception and your thinking. If it's your Venus, then it's a restructuring of your own sense of personal worth, self-esteem, and value, and how you approach your relationships. If it's your Mars, then what is up for this deep restructuring is how you pursue your goals, how you translate your will into action, what you want, and what motivates you. If it's your Jupiter, then we are looking at a deep restructuring of your belief systems, your worldview, and the direction of your future growth. And of course, as we said in our Jupiter in Capricorn podcast, as Jupiter conjuncts Pluto in 2020 in April, March, and July, and begins a new synodic cycle, we are looking at in part where certain beliefs and paradigms, that's Jupiter, need to break down, that's Pluto, within the collective consciousness. So in broad terms, a line of questioning in this sort of Saturn-Pluto approach, this sort of Saturn-Pluto toolkit. The question is, what needs to break down in my life? What habitual patterns? What are the ways in which I have structured my existence up to this point that need to now be broken down, especially where these habitual patterns get in the way of my own maturation. So what needs to be faced, Saturn, and released or eliminated or purified, Pluto, from the personality? So situations that force you to address deeper subconscious programming, especially in relation to the departments of life symbolized by the planets that we've just outlined. So Saturn Pluto represents, on one level, the task of letting go of certain attachments. With Saturn Pluto on personal and collective levels, we are dealing with inner psychic restructuring and regeneration at the deepest of levels, which then begins to produce outer forms, that's Saturn, which are deeply altered, Pluto. So the inner always goes hand in hand with the outer. So with Saturn Pluto, we think about, well, where is intense effort required of me? Personally and collectively, we may see the need for having to expend intense effort, but with small amounts of resources. Fortitude and deep inner resilience in the face of harsh conditions or even darkness. And this playing out on personal and collective levels. So Saturn Pluto is asking for a heightened degree of fortitude and inner resilience. So there is a rising to the occasion that is demanded by 2020. So observe this in your personal lives and in the lives of people around you. This is a shared collective moment. With Saturn Pluto in Capricorn, we also confront serious, or let's say more grim realities, crises of all kinds. So we're at a point on the planet where we are beginning to reap the ecological and environmental consequences of big profit-led businesses, these sorts of mega corporations, Capricorn. So if we do not seriously begin to put things in place to deal with our plastics disposal problem, for example, ooh, then we are in the deepest of crises. And that is a grave understatement there. And this is where Saturn in Aquarius comes in. So Saturn's movement from the late degrees of Capricorn, where it's dancing with Pluto and then later Jupiter. Saturn's movement from these degrees into Aquarius is going to highlight the issues that face humanity on the widest scale. So, where no matter what your race, your gender, or how you personally identify, there are issues facing all of us that transcend all of these divisions, issues that concern the feasibility of human life on the planet in the widest of terms. And this is the domain of Aquarius. So Saturn will demand a facing up to these issues, facing the failures of Capricorn systems and the effects on the human race as a whole, and the demand for, as we said, a new consciousness and a new type of ingenuity to face up to these issues. But Saturn Pluto invites us all to think about, in this watershed moment of 2020, what must be done in the face of resistance, great resistance, or harsh conditions or obstacles. So again, Saturn Pluto demanding a lot from us personally and collectively. The willpower Pluto to walk up the mountain, to face the hard task of walking up that Capricorn mountain. And Capricorn is, of course, the mountain goat. So, with Saturn Pluto, once we get accustomed to the energy, it can be a good time to cultivate a deep inner sense of purposefulness, deep determination, resilience, and a certain relentless discipline, which is exactly what might be needed to meet the tasks ahead. So remember this. The advantage with Saturn Pluto is a deep concentration of energy, really learning how to focus and apply the deepest inner reserves of your psychic energy and your psychic inheritance. So there is a lot of mileage to be had too from Saturn Pluto. It is an invitation, this conjunction is an invitation into deep mastery of your psychic energy, mastery of the deepest energies inside of you and the highest standard of their application. So Saturn Pluto, personally and collectively, presents the task of understanding how to manage deep reserves of intense energies. Are you qualified enough to handle this kind of power and intensity? So throughout the collective, as Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter dance with each other in a triple conjunction, we may really be asked to have or to cultivate a sense of deep moral determination, deep sort of stoicism, sort of the British way, keep calm and carry on. As we alluded to earlier, the ripening and maturation that comes from facing difficult experiences or realities. Also, the idea of rebuilding things, that's Saturn, from the rubble, Pluto. And here's a big one for us all, personally and collectively. Saturn Pluto represents the empowerment Pluto that comes from facing our fear, Saturn. And here's one more fun one for us. Honest and deep self-appraisal. Who doesn't like that? I'm teasing. So Saturn Pluto is the invitation to really face reality in every sphere, a deep, non-superficial look at all reality. So personal reality and collective reality, a deep understanding of the facts in any given domain of reality. So those are some of the tasks, the psychological orientations and attitudes that this watershed moment of 2020 is demanding of us in the form of a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And then as Jupiter hurtles through Capricorn and joins the Saturn-Pluto dance, the question is for each of us, well, what opportunities and rewards, Jupiter, come from embracing the tasks that Saturn Pluto have assigned to us? What rewards come when we manage our energy, when we apply resilience and determination, intense effort, when we embrace the maturation that comes from facing less than ideal realities? What rewards come when we create our reality more from a place of empowerment? So, what rewards do we reap from staying the Saturn Pluto course? So, we're keeping this simple and sort of thinking about all of this in the broadest of terms. Now, the other major shift in 2020 that I would like to highlight is the shift of the nodal axis into Gemini and Sagittarius, the nodes of the moon. So, north node in Gemini, south node in Sagittarius, and of course, we are now moving into eclipses in those signs. So, this shift raises some really important questions. South node in Sag, where have our collective and personal beliefs, our paradigms become distorted? Where have they become distorted? And where do we need to in turn clean up our perception? Gemini. So the Gemini North Node is asking us on one level to go back to the drawing board. What am I looking at? What is it? So Gemini first has to do with perception, the act of perception, which of course then becomes thinking and language. So we should note that we're having a shift of the South Node into Sagittarius on the heels of Jupiter being in Sagittarius and the Jupiter-Neptune squares of 2019. As we've spoken about quite a bit on the channel, these Jupiter-Neptune squares really highlighted a sort of amplification of confusion within the collective being in broad terms, in the cognitive place of not knowing how to make head or tail of data or information, much less how to come away with reasonable, sound conclusions or beliefs. And all of this was driven by a lot of media speculation, driven by the content available readily on all our devices. So collectively, we are in a space where we have to be so discerning with data and information. We are living essentially on different islands of belief. So we are in the era of fake news, faulty perceptions, faulty beliefs, cognitive decline, confusion, not knowing who or what to believe. All sorts of different perspectives and paradigms and beliefs are available for the choosing. All of that is available on our devices too. So, with all of these perspectives and beliefs and paradigms available, choose wisely. So, the Gemini Sagittarius sign pair, where the nodes will be, this sign pair calls into question the kinds of conclusions that we draw in relation to the kind of data that we are presented with. So this has everything to do with mind and perception. And perception is the most valuable commodity these days. So who controls or is able to control your perception wields a lot of power. Think about that. In this highly mediated world of moving pictures on our devices and all sorts of clips which create certain perceptions. So with the South Node in Sagittarius, we want to pay attention to what Jupiter is doing. Jupiter governs Sagittarius. And Jupiter, throughout the year, even before it approaches the conjunction with Saturn in Aquarius, throughout 2020, Jupiter is essentially within a few degrees of Saturn. So they're sort of in a conjunction, and it's Jupiter in Capricorn. And Capricorn and Saturn are archetypes that call for more maturity, putting away childish things, coming into more adulthood. So we are collectively being asked for a maturation and coming into more adulthood. in relation to our beliefs and worldviews and paradigms, all symbolized by the Jupiter Sagittarius planet sign matrix. All right, so as we said, Saturn dips into Aquarius in March of 2020, but it settles down in the sign in December 2020, December 17 or 18, thereabouts. And that is shortly followed by Jupiter's entrance into the sign of Aquarius on about December 19 or 20. Then we have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius on December 21 at the solstice and the beginning of a new Jupiter-Saturn synodic cycle. So we are beginning to see the Aquarius field, the Aquarius sign energy being highlighted. So in the domain of Aquarius are the issues that affect humanity as a whole. Aquarius is an air sign representing on one level the collective mind, or as we said, the human collective mental grid. And the internet in that respect is quite Aquarian. So it's the sign that wants to advance the collective through new ideas which become new technologies, new inventions. It's the sign that is principally concerned with the thought that goes into how we structure human society. So Aquarius has to do with the paradigms that pertain to how we go about structuring collective human existence. It has to do with the rules of society. So Aquarius asks, how do we structure society? What is the intellectual basis on which we structure a society in order to preserve the personal freedom of all individuals within that larger society or group? So Aquarius is also deeply, fundamentally concerned with the question of personal freedom within a larger collective context. So in sort of broad terms, Aquarius says to itself, well, every individual in the group has a right to his or her own self-expression. Aquarius says, well, I care about structuring society in such a way where individuals have the right to be what and who they are. So since Aquarius represents the individualized human who advances the group and moves it forward, Aquarius sort of, marches into a futuristic vision that is radically different from the present status quo. So Aquarius sort of naturally leaves things behind. It represents the independence of mind required to introduce new consciousness into the collective. So it relies on qualities of daring to think differently in order to introduce new thought into collective systems. So it's not trying to follow what has already been established. So the Aquarian path is a path that has never been trod. So we have a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the sign. We have to begin to look at this conjunction on different levels. So first we have a personal psychological component, experiencing the interplay between Jupiter's expanding influence and Saturn's contracting one. So perhaps on the personal psychological level, we could sort of come up with a formulation like this, expanding into new fields of experience, expanding into new territories, Jupiter, goes hand in hand with taking on responsibility, Saturn. So let's put this in very practical terms. So let's say you buy your first home. So you are expanding into the new possibilities, potentials, and experiences of home ownership. Jupiter's expanding influence there. But to assume the title of homeowner, you have a lot more responsibility. So the task to maintain the yard is now yours. You now have to pay your property taxes. So this dynamic of having rewarding new experience along with an up leveling in your sense of responsibility, but also limitation. So you've decided, definitely where you want to live. You've settled into a given area. You decided the boundaries of your experience on the home front. So I've bought a home in Timbuktu. This is where I'm going to live. So in effect, I've shut off a variety of options and experiences by committing to living in a certain location. So that's the sort of example there. So we want to be aware of this kind of interplay on the personal psychological level. So as you look at where this conjunction falls in your chart and how it's affecting the planets there, this is something to bear in mind. And essentially, throughout 2020, from about April or so, Jupiter and Saturn are within a few degrees of each other, even when Saturn dips into Aquarius, while Jupiter is still in the late degrees of Capricorn. We have a sort of out of sign conjunction going on there. So this interplay between Jupiter and Saturn is something that is an essential tone, an important tone throughout 2020. So Saturn deepens. It brings certain dimensions of our lives into clear focus. And as Jupiter conjuncts Saturn, Jupiter says, hey, you can now go forward in your life based on things coming into clear focus, based on your understanding very clearly what is. So Saturn is about work, as we said, the master work of your life. And Jupiter says, okay, let's expand your vision for your life work, your life direction. Saturn says, okay, keep your nose to the grindstone, do the work. And Jupiter, along with that, Saturn says, hey, while you are doing your Saturn work, have a good attitude. Be optimistic about the rewards of that work. Have the vision for the future, that's Jupiter, but attend to what needs to be done now in the form of your duties and responsibilities, Saturn. So here's a little exercise of sorts. See if you can be alert to the voices of Saturn and Jupiter inside of you, relative to any situation that you have going on in your life. So how can you integrate them in the best way? And here's an example of what I call the at least proposition. And I'd like to invite clients to do this homework. So the voice of Saturn says, geez, I have all of this new financial responsibility. And Jupiter says, well, at least I can meet my financial responsibilities. At least I have the money to meet my responsibilities. So Jupiter can bring a sort of rehabilitation, a sort of alignment of our inner attitude. Jupiter, an alignment of our inner attitude to see the best in a Saturnian situation. So Jupiter, Saturn, what attitude and beliefs, that's Jupiter, do I impose onto my concrete experience, Saturn? So how can I tweak my attitude and beliefs, that's Jupiter, in order to have a more rewarding experience of the realities of my life, that's Saturn? So a few things to think about there, operating on the personal psychological level. So you want to see how this line of questioning may help you to make the best of Jupiter, Saturn going through a certain house or triggering certain planets. Then we have Jupiter, Saturn on the more macro level. And Aquarius itself calls our attention to what is going on in terms of the broadest macro levels of our social organization as a species. So Jupiter, Saturn in Aquarius, the beginning of this new synodic cycle in Aquarius calls our attention to the issues that affect humanity as a whole. And in this globalized world, with the internet as the collective glue, so to speak, our sense of being connected across borders is so much more advanced than in generations past. So, on the broadest of levels, humanity is beginning to understand and work with the concept of the collective mind. So, in broad terms, the internet is a response to that inner bio-spiritual development taking place within the species at this evolutionary juncture. So, an appreciation of the collective mind. So, yes, our sense of being connected as a sort of daily awareness is far more advanced than in generations past. I'm now aware that the plastics which get dumped in the sea on one side of the world affects me in the other side of the world. And the world watches with great interest what is going on within the United States political landscape. And of course, speaking of the USA, 2020 will no doubt be an interesting year, election year, and as we go into 2021, Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius will join up with the USA's South Node at 6 degrees of Aquarius. So interesting times ahead. And of course, the USA is approaching a Pluto return. So lots to talk about there. So there are a few things I want to kind of note about the beginning of a new Jupiter-Saturn synodic cycle in Aquarius. So Jupiter and Saturn join up with each other every 20 years. So one is this question of who is in the group and what does it mean to be human in the modern age. So the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction sort of raises the issue in Aquarius, the issue of expanding notions of how humanity can be expressed. So there is this business of having to contend with expanded ideas of what being human is. So what spectrum of expression and behaviors do we accept now into our collective notion of humanity? So we are beginning to deal with these questions. What expressions of gender and sex do we admit into the spectrum of being human? That's a big one here. And then the other thing is, how various AI technologies, artificial intelligence, intersects with the biological human. Now that is quite a Pandora's box to open. The other box, genetic modification of all kinds. The other box, who else is in the solar system, in the galaxy, and how do we relate to that question? So who and what is human? So the question is, in the next few years, how do we come up with ideals for society, rules that have to do with the expanding expression of what being human is? What philosophy of society, Jupiter in Aquarius, are we going to construct? Saturn in Aquarius. So what new social thought and paradigms are we going to need in order to meet the shifting face of the human being in the modern age? So these are the questions for the next 20 years. So Jupiter, Saturn in Aquarius. Expansive activity to build new social thought and structures to keep up with the shifting dynamic of what it means to be human in the modern age. But then a confrontation between these sorts of philosophical ideals for society and that philosophy, Jupiter, running up against certain limitations, Saturn. And as we hinted at, the other thing that this conjunction portends is having to address and deal with in heightened ways our ethical responsibilities and duties in relation to technology. So Jupiter has to do with ethics. And an example comes to mind. There is extensive research being done and petitions being written, and scientists, all kinds of scientists, chiming in about the effect of 5G wireless technology on the body. So these are the things that we're going to have to deal with in heightened ways, the ethical considerations. So facing up to the realities and the ethical considerations of our relationship to technologies. But Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions tend to release a new spirit, a new vision for what can be achieved in any given domain. So no doubt we will see that amplified, and amplified there, nice Jupiter word. So we'll see that amplified in terms of our technological accomplishments. But perhaps as we reach the Jupiter-Saturn opposition point of the cycle, we may have to confront some of the limitations of technological expansion and the concrete effects of all of that. So again, some food for thought there as we get into Aquarian territory. All right, so I'd like to wish each of you a fantastic year, a year of clarity of mind, optimism, of spirit, strength, of purpose. Keep your wits about you. And remember always that there is a logic and purpose to everything, and that you are soul fortified to meet your lives with dignity, with grace, and equanimity. Yes. And for good measure, I'll also include a song selection by Mr. David Bowie. Nice to let the imagination travel and let music stimulate you as well as you think about the astrology of our time. So I'll put the link in a pinned comment below the video. And reminding you too, as usual, that I'm available for private astrological counseling consultations, and links to that can be found in the description box below the video. So until next time, folks, talk soon. Bye.